And we're live. So welcome everyone to tonight's Out of the Archives. I'm Jonah Lacqua. I am the History Project's Executive Director. And I'm so happy that you're all here with us on a very hot Thursday evening in Boston. So for those of you who are not familiar with the History Project, we are Boston's LGBTQ community archives. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are volunteer driven. And we are dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing LGBTQ history. And that's both in Boston and Massachusetts and really in New England. And I'm so happy to invite you to this digital Out of the Archives. We are here most Thursday nights, so if you're interested in queer history, please be sure to follow us on social media to learn about our upcoming events, or check out our YouTube to catch up on some of our former Out of the Archives talks. Before I introduce our speaker, I have two plugs. The first is that I invite you to check out our project, #QueerArchivesAtHome, which is a crowdsourced digital archives of pictures, videos, and stories shared by the LGBTQ community, and basically to document our personal histories. So while you are at home, do me a favor and check out your boxes, your bags, your closets, your bookshelves, anywhere else you might keep things that tell your personal story, and please add that story to LGBTQ history. The second plug is that we are fundraising. We're always fundraising, but we're fundraising specifically to ask folks to set up recurring donations for the History Project. So if you're interested in supporting our work and supporting the archives, please consider making a recurring donation of any size. Recurring donations are great because they give us the security to take long-term steps towards a sustainable future for the archives. And those are my plugs. So I'll put some links in the chat. But with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, EE Ottoman. EE is an author of queer fiction and a disabled queer trans man who divides his time between history, archiving, and romance writing. His most recent works are The Doctor's Discretion and The Craft of Love, and I will be dropping links to both of those books so that you can pick them up in the chat. And now, EE, I turn it over to you. After EE's talk, I'll moderate a quick Q&A, so please drop your questions in the chat as we go.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's doing really well. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation. Let's just get that up. All right. So the talk that I'm going to give this evening is, I'm calling it A Queer Moment in Time, Writing Trans and Queer Historical Romance Novels. I'm really going to focus on kind of my process when it comes to research and world building for queer and trans historical romance novels. So it's very focused on kind of like what my process is, and hopefully that'll be interesting and helpful for all of you to hear about. So just like a quick introduction, like Joan said, I am a romance author. I write under the pen name EE Ottoman. I've been publishing for about 9 years. I write exclusively queer romance and predominantly trans romance, which is romance novels with at least one trans main character. That's kind of like what I'm known for. So when it comes to historical romance, romance and historical romance tends to be a genre that's very self-referential. So there are tropes that get repeated and frameworks that most people who write white, cisgender, heterosexual historical romance tend to work inside of. But when you are centering the stories of BIPOC characters or queer characters or trans characters, this framework might not fit and probably is not going to be your best bet for accurately representing that history. To me, that is a real opportunity to write a different kind of historical romance novel, to step outside of that framework and think about different kinds of stories, different kinds of narratives, and also different historical settings and different geographic settings from kind of the very 19th century English focused historical romance that tends to really dominate the genre. So when I approach kind of the world building for my historical romance novels, first of all, as far as like inspiration goes, I'm like a huge history geek. I like love history. I read it. I have 2 degrees in history. So a lot of my inspiration for my stories really comes from queer and trans history. So usually I start out with a good idea for characters, kind of who they are, and then a really general sense of the setting. And that's when I kind of dig into more focused research and also how I'm going to build out that moment in time and make it a really deep and rich setting that readers will feel like they're experiencing along with the characters. And how I kind of do that is I focus on 2 main aspects of that world building, which is understanding queer identity and community, queer and trans identity and community, and understanding intersectionality and how those things are going to play out in my book. So when I tackle researching queer identity and community, I really come to it asking myself the questions, what did the trans and queer community look like during the time period that I want to set the story in? How were they policed? What were people's personal experiences of being queer or being trans? What kind of language did they use, or how did they articulate their identity? And then how does this relate to modern queer and trans people's understanding of identity and community? And because we're doing queer history and trans history, and this is like a very understudied subject. You're not going to pick up one book and find the answer to all of these questions. It's really going to mean that you're going to have to look through, or I found for me, it means that I really have to look through a number of books and articles and sometimes go to primary sources and use that archival research. But these are the questions that I'm really looking to answer. And in some cases, depending on your time period and your setting, you might not be able to answer all of these questions. You may have to extrapolate or take an educated guess. But just asking these questions and thinking about these questions is going to make the way that you write and articulate queerness and transness in your historical setting really kind of rich and nuanced. So part of this that I kind of want to zero in on is the question of language. So the thing about being a historical fiction writer is that I'm really trying to create a bridge between the historical realities and modern readership. And a kind of something that I think about a lot, especially when I'm doing this part of the research process, this part of the world building process, is language. And that's because the modern language that we use, the modern terminology to talk about gender and sexuality is not very old. And older terminology is not really that legible to modern readers. So for example, my book, The Doctor's Discretion takes place in New York City in the 1830s. And, you know, obviously in the 1830s, you know, the term homosexual didn't exist, the concept didn't exist, the term queer didn't exist, the term trans didn't exist, transsexual or the concept of being transsexual didn't exist, transvestite didn't exist, all of this kind of language that a modern reader might be familiar with. And usually when you look at the primary sources, you're seeing a lot more like reference to like cross-dressing, but for modern readers, cross-dressing means something very different than being trans. It's not that understandable. So really what I end up doing in order to get over this language barrier is to really think about the experience of being trans, the parts of that experience that is going to be the same for someone living in the 1830s as someone living now. So, you know, the frustration and pain and sadness of having your gender not be legible to the people around you, being misgendered, being mislabeled, along with that joy and fulfillment and beauty that can come from having people see you as the gender that you actually are. You know, that's really something I think that we experience now and something that folks experienced in the 1830s. And so I'm really going to want, when I'm thinking about how I'm going to describe this experience of being trans, how I'm going to have this trans character who is both deeply embedded in this historical moment and also legible to a modern reader. It's really about describing that experience that, if not universal, is pretty translatable. But yeah, language is something that is pretty difficult and that I think about a lot when it comes to the world building and how these characters are going to interact in that world while also being read correctly by a modern readership. So the other thing that I really concentrate on when I'm kind of doing this world building is intersectionality. A character's race, class, educational background, religion, disability status, probably other things are going to intersect with their gender and sexuality, and are going to really change their experience and how they really experience the world. So questions that I'm asking myself as I'm creating this setting and as I'm doing the research so I can create this setting that is also guiding what I'm looking for are, what does these multiple intersecting identities mean for the way they navigate the world, the characters navigate the world? How does it affect how they think about themselves? How is their queer identity or transness affected by this intersectionality? And then what communities are or not available to them? So that is something that I'm really going to have to, you know, address in my story and in my world building. And think about and research, because, you know, obviously Black people's experience of being queer or being trans is very different from white people's experience when we're talking about any time in New York City history. And I write pretty much exclusively stories set in New York. So these are kind of the two sections, queer identity and trans identity and community, and then intersectionality are the questions that I'm asking myself that is guiding me through the research process in order to build out that world. After I do that research is when I do the general period research. So this is a little bit backwards. When I started writing historical romance, I did a lot of reading blogs and reading websites about like kind of how to research and how to world build historical romance. And most of what they said was period research, period research, period research. But I really found that for me writing queer romance, historical romance, and trans historical romance, the period research really has to come second. I really have to understand how queer people and trans people were thinking about themselves, how they were creating community together, and how their intersecting identities were affecting their lives before I could then go in and do, like, what did the houses look like? What did restaurants look like? What were people eating? What were they dressing? How were they dressing? And that kind of more typical period research. And I really think that this approach is a good one and helps kind of build out that world, because at the end of the day, if you have a really good grasp of what queerness and transness was like in that historical moment, what that community looked like, how people were interacting with each other, their relationships, the ways that it affected their interaction with the world around them, and you really have a solid understanding of that and you're putting it into your story, then whether or not your character is wearing the right kind of coat isn't really going to matter, as far as like having that kind of deep, in-depth experience for the reader of actually being in that historical moment. So this is kind of the phases that I do to do that research. One area that I think kind of brings all of these different things together is how I've thought about and constructed space in my books, and how my characters navigate different space. So, for example, in The Doctor's Discretion, there's a scene where Augustus, who is white, and William, who is black, go to a restaurant, and they have very different experiences of that restaurant. And those experiences are really shaped by William's race, by both of their race, and also the fact that Augustus is trans. And the ways that they navigate that space, how comfortable they are in it, the details they notice are really dictated by that intersectionality of identity for both of them. When I wrote Remembrance, or when I was thinking about how to write Remembrance's workspace in A Craft of Love, how I thought about the scenes that took place in that space and how I thought about creating that space was in part dictated by kind of the practicality of the kind of work that she does. She does very, very detailed needlework. She's a quilter and an embroiderer, and she does very detailed needlework, but also the fact that she is a craftswoman and her clients are very, very wealthy New York City elites. And when they come to her to employ her, they want to be in a space that shows that she is respectable, that she is upstanding, but that she is of lower class to them. And there's a one scene in particular where she tells Benjamin, who is the other main character in that story, that the coffee pot that he's making for her can't be too fancy, because her clients won't like that. They won't want to employ her if they feel like she's putting on airs. And so that space and how she moves through that space and how I created that space is really dictated by her position as this middle-class craftswoman who is employed by these very, very elite women. In one of the drafts I'm currently working on, it's set in the 1950s, and the characters go to a restaurant which is owned by a queer person and is mostly catered to queer people, and then they also go to several cruising spots. And so that kind of allowed me to think about space which is either created for or claimed by the queer community, and had that the queerness really be kind of dictating, you know, how those spaces are created and how people interact with those spaces. So, you know, in order to create that richness in these moments and in these spaces, I need to be thinking about queer community and how that's formed, intersectionality of identity, and then also that general research of like, oh, what are the chairs going to look like? You know, kind of like, you know, what are the waiters going to do? What are they eating at the restaurant? So I think like that's one of the areas where you can see kind of all of these little pieces of this research come together to create these scenes. So I feel like we went through that really quick. So now that I've like talked about all of this kind of overarching theory of research, here are just some practical recommendations that I have for research that I've used. And I do exclusively write about New York City, so that's what this is focused on. And then these are trans history resources. And then I really want to do a fast plug of Hugh Ryan's Patreon account. For $1 a month, you can become a subscriber, and that's really where he posts all of his research for when Brooklyn was queer. And if you haven't read that, go read that. It's fantastic. And then his upcoming book, The House of D. And he's very, very generous with sharing photographs and newspaper clippings and just all sorts of things related to the history of the queer and trans community in New York City. And if you're interested in that topic, it's an invaluable resource that I would really, really recommend. So I'm done early. I ran, which is more time for questions.
Awesome, thank you. And let's see. So folks, we have a question from Richard that I'm going to kick us off with. Richard said he's looking for, or they are looking forward to reading your work. The language appropriate to period is so important to them, and that they've read historical fiction in the past, and that contemporary terms kind of set off an alarm for them. And so they mentioned that they end up researching the term to see if it's historically correct, and they're wondering, how do you navigate words and terms you use in your writing?
Like just in general, not necessarily related to like queerness or transness.
I'm not sure. Richard, do you want to follow up? Or if you want to speak to both, I think both are kind of an interesting. Richard's saying general everyday terms.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that if you do a lot of reading of things that are written during your time period, then you get a kind of better handle on how people were talking, the language they used. the kind of terminology that they referred to. But then if there's like a moment where I'm unsure, I always research the term just to see like if I can figure out when it started being used and things. And then I've been really lucky to have editors who are also really good. And if they see a term that kind of brings up a red flag, like, oh, that was probably not used until later, then they'll flag that down and be like, look at this, because I don't think that this is historically correct. So as far as, queerness and transness, I draw, again, I do a lot of reading sources from that specific time period and thinking about how people, the language that people are using to describe queer and trans people, to when we are lucky enough to have documentation that is authored by queer and trans people, how what language they are using to talk about themselves. And then, of course, then I have to go through the process, like I was talking about earlier in the presentation, of is this language going to be legible to a modern reader, because these kinds of terms have changed so much, especially, if we're thinking about my last two books, which were set in the 1830s, and like that's almost 200 years ago. So like the way that we talk about gender and sexuality is so different. And then it comes down to kind of navigating that by describing experience more than leaning on specific terminology and specific language choices.
Great. So we have another question from Heather in the chat. And if anyone wants to ask a question, please feel free to keep using the chat or do the hand raise function and I can unmute you. But Heather's question is, she would like you to talk about how you approach the question of happily ever after for queer and trans romances. And the scripts that are assumed for male and female romances aren't necessarily available.
Yes, so this is a really great topic because this is kind of like a fraught topic in the romance industry. There is a lot of readers who are coming predominantly from cis-het romance who really don't feel like happily ever after is possible for queer and trans people in historical romance. That, in order for there to be a happily ever after, folks have to get married, they have to own property together, they have to have a biological child, and like if your couple can't do that, then they can't have a happily ever after ending. And I think like for me, first of all, like I just let that go. But I think that I really try in my romance to mirror the many diverse ways that our queer and trans ancestors have found joy and happiness together. And sometimes that looks like living together openly, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it looks like marriage, sometimes it doesn't. And that's a reality that I really want to reflect in my writing. And some people are not going to buy that as a happily ever after ending. Some people are just not going to get it. And that's just something that I've had to come to terms with and let go of. Yeah.
And so I realized for this audience, which is, I think there are more romance people here than usual, but I see some history people here and some intersections of those two groups. So most romances, in order to call a piece romance, needs to have a happily ever after. And that's sort of where this question is coming from. And it's interesting, I mean, in queer history and representation of queer couples in media historically, there's like almost never a happily ever after for the queer characters. Like lesbians getting arrested in pulp novels or getting caught or getting Hays codes. And I think Oh, and we have a comment, somebody saying it did happen, one simply has to look for it. They just finished teaching a class on the subject and think many who took it were excited to discover in England, at least it happened, which is great. But yeah, I think there's a lot of baggage, I think, around the idea of happily ever after, in both romance and history. So I think it's an interesting question and something to constantly be thinking and fighting against, I think, as romance evolves. And again, I say this as somebody who's not a romance writer, but is a reader and voyeuristically watches the fights happen on Twitter. So we have another question from Sarah that's in, and they say, obviously with spec fic, fantasy, sci-fi, steampunk, etc., you aren't limited to the reality of racism and homophobia or transphobia, but do you have any suggestions for making the social world building seem more authentic, especially if you're still basing your setting on a certain historical time and location?
So I really, because I write romance novels, my stories are predominant, like the point of my stories are to be happy and uplifting, and to give queer and trans people, and also, my lovely cishet readers, a refuge from the realities, that we all face. But that being said, I don't want to erase the real struggles that people faced in the past. And so I think that it's a real balance. And it's one of those things that I play by ear depending on the book and kind of what tone I want. A Doctor's Discretion deals with a lot of heavy topics. It deals with slavery. Both of the main characters are doctors, so I talk about the long, horrible history of abuse of trans people and queer people and people of color by the medical profession. And I tried in that book to not erase those topics and not make light of those topics, but to handle them gently and make the romance arc and the happy ending the focus of the story. The Craft of Love is 100% just like light, fluffy goodness, and so in that one, I really was not going to get into a lot of these kind of harder topics. And it's not there. Benjamin, who is the trans character, has all of these complicated feelings about his mother and the fact that she didn't accept his identity. So it's there in the background, but it's not, but it doesn't, the main point of the story is to be happy, fluffy escapism. So it's acknowledged, but I don't dwell on it in that story. So it really comes down to kind of the book that I'm writing and also the time period and setting, and the characters, who they are and what kind of intersectional violence and oppression they would be facing in that historical moment. But yeah, it's a thing.
It's a balancing act. And it's sort of, again, speaking as a historian and an archivist, sometimes there's a tendency to look at the past and think, man, things were terrible back then and things are so great now. And it's far more nuanced than that. Yeah. There are times in the past that there were terrible things happening and wonderful things happening all at the same time. And it's more complicated than past was bad and we found love in a hopeless place. So we have another question in the chat that I think is a good segue from this last question, from Shana? I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly, I apologize. But they're asking, are there time periods that are easier to write or harder to write queer and trans romance in. And they're thinking either because of a lack of historical research, lack of or increasing oppression, fun parties, etc. What time periods are underrepresented in queer romance? And they say, also, I love your books.
Yes, so there are definitely, like, the further back in time you go, the less resources you have, and that's like a real thing. You know, when I've wrote several books that are set in the beginning of the 19th century, and then I've kind of jumped forward and I've been working on several projects which are set in the 20th century, and it's like a huge difference in the amount of resources that I can get. You know, I went from really digging to find kind of resources, particularly about the trans community, to having the privilege of being able to read things that trans people actually wrote for themselves. And so I think that, yeah, it becomes like the further back in time you get, the harder it is to find resources. And so from that perspective, books set in an earlier time period can be harder. I'm not going to speak to setting books outside of a Western setting because I just haven't done that research. I've not done that. I can't speak to that. But certainly from my experience of setting books in the United States history, the further back you go, the harder it gets as far as finding source material. But then setting a book in the 20th century has this problem of, you know, such intense kind of violence and policing. I have one book that I was working on that's set in the 1950s, and it was just brutal, you know, everything that I have. So yeah, so I find like it's a balancing act. And I think that, like, for me, it's like a good time to reflect back on like the question before, right? And even if you're writing a book during a time when there was a lot of policing and a lot of violence aimed at the community, you can still, I 100% believe, write a good romance because, like, exactly like you said, things were more complicated than that, right? You know, like, it's not just, oh, it was doom and gloom all the time, 24/7, and, you know, like, our life was a constant tragedy. Like, that's just not the way that people live, and that's just not the way that history is. And also, I think that you can write good historical romance for time periods where there is less historical research. You're just gonna, you know, you're gonna have to dig deeper and also make a lot of educated guesses at the end of the day. So, and like, I think like what I always tell myself in that situation is that at the end of the day, I'm writing fiction. So it's not like I'm writing a journal article where I would want to make no educated guesses in a perfect world. You know, I'm writing a romance novel, so I can give myself a little bit of leeway to say, okay, this is where the fiction comes in, is where the historical record has gaps.
Oh, I'm muted. That makes me think of a professor I had who was an early modernist. And so she looked at early modern England. And one time we were talking about doing research, and she was like, I only have a finite amount of sources. I cannot imagine doing history about the 20th century, where there's just so much that you could get sucked into researching as you're trying to write your history. So I have a question from Mercy in the chat, and they're asking, how do you find and create places that may have been friendly to the community that may have been erased in the account? And they're asking, you know, it's not in the text that you can see because it's hidden or not. written about. Have you dealt with that?
So I think like what we're asking is like, how do we create community spaces that have been erased from the historical narrative, or the historical record? Yeah, so the research on, okay, so let's say the research on trans spaces in the early half of the 19th century United States is a really super, super under-researched area. Anyone who's looking for a research topic, I would love that. So really like, I think like for me, I need to come to the research with hope. Start from your research from the perspective that LGBTQ people have always built community, and we've always found each other and been able to be in community with each other in some way. And then look at your research for whatever you have. Often it'll be like, cisgendered queer men who make it into the record most times, and say, all right, so this is one way that it could have existed. And then, again, you're writing historical fiction, so that's where the fiction comes in. That's where you give the gift of saying, I believe that these spaces would have existed for everyone.
Great. And you have a list of sources that you've used to try to create these worlds. And so there's been, like you're saying, so there's some gaps there. And I was thinking, there's a recent book by Jen Mannion called Female Husbands, which is about pre-World War One trans history, which might fill in that, but you're right, there aren't like an enormous amount of historians writing this history right now, although it's becoming more easy to find as time goes on, which is exciting.
I think that, like, especially with trans history, we're just starting to see that wave, which is really exciting. And yeah, actually that book is on my list of trans resources. So
great. Yeah, and
that have come
and
out.
I'd be happy I'd be happy to send your resources out in an email to everyone afterwards if they want to start looking into this themselves.
Yeah, I recently on Twitter shared a longer list of resources that I've used, and I can send that to you, and you can send that out, because I think that would be helpful for folks, or that may be helpful for folks.
That would be awesome. And so we have another question in the chat. And like I said, if folks want to ask questions, use that hand raise thing and I can unmute you. But if you want to keep hearing me, I'm happy to read the questions. Are there any queer writers that you find inspiring, whether that's in fiction or nonfiction?
Yeah, there are lots of queer authors that I find inspiring. Shout out to Mae Peterson, who writes romance, who's a trans author, who's amazing, and she also does like really great editing work as well. Obviously, Hugh Ryan, who writes nonfiction, does really, really great work. His history is really great. I'm a big fan of his. I always like when people are like, name your favorite historian, like romance authors. I'm always like my mind always goes completely blank. But there are so many really, really talented queer and trans authors working in romance right now.
Yeah, it's that's such a hard question, because then who are you leaving off of the list?
Right, exactly.
But
pretty much everyone this time. So.
So Andrea is asking, what about letters and journals? Like, where are you finding those kinds of primary sources, and are you using them as you're doing your writing?
Yes. So that really depends on where I am, how much like actual, whether or not I can actually go to an archive. Really depends on kind of like where I am and what I'm doing when I research a book. But I know, like, for example, I was thinking about writing a story, which has since been backburnered, specifically about um, letter writing in the early 19th century, because there's this really robust history of same-sex couples writing each other letters that reflect a really kind of deep romantic relationship, which was probably sometimes sexual and sometimes not, but it was very, very romantic. And I thought, oh, wouldn't this be a great romance novel? And it may be indeed one day when I come back to it. And while I was doing that research, I found that there's a couple good books, which are not actually on my list of recommendations, but that's a good note to me to go back and add them, which are specifically on this subject, and have tons and tons and tons of excerpts and examples of same-sex couples who are involved in these really intense relationships writing to each other. So, and yeah, when I can get journals, absolutely amazing. That's predominantly letters. Journals are predominantly where you're going to get pre-20th century, where you're going to get queer and trans people actually talking about themselves. So yeah, when I can get those resources, that's amazing.
Yeah, and you linked to, there are places like the Transgender Digital Archives that has some of this
Yeah.
information. There are other historical societies and queer community archives that have some things digitized, but mostly not everything. So
Yeah, if you are um, if you are doing 20th century history and you've not read We Both Laughed in Pleasure, Lou Sullivan's diaries, then I really, really recommend it. You know, he was a gay trans man. It's really a great resource if that's where your focus is for your stories.
yeah, and so the chat's mentioning a couple of favorite authors. Tim mentions Pat Calafia, who I Googled. It's a bi-trans writer. Kat Sebastian and KJ Charles for fiction. I would throw in, not for, well, I would throw in Jordan L. Hawk to historical romance.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm gonna add We Both Laughed in Pleasure to my to read list. Yeah, I'm curious. So, oh, here, Tim. There we go. Tim, at least I told you to unmute, I think.
Hey there, EE and everybody. So one of your resources lists Lou Sullivan, and I'm sure it's not the same Lou Sullivan who's a Black male physician who's pretty renowned in the US. Louis Sullivan, MD. But I found it provocative because of the subject of physicians of color in the 18th century or the 19th century. So, and even though I haven't read that book, I'm definitely going to read that now and suggest it to my book club. But I guess my point is, I have 2 points. One is, in your research, did you find that there were many physicians of color beyond, you know, unrecognized nursing aide types or actual RNs, who there were many of color all through the 1800s. But about physicians, first of all, what did you find out about the, whether they're First Nation, people of color? And then the second thing is, if there's time, what are you reading these days?
So to begin with, yes. So specifically for the first half of the 19th century, which is what I was concentrating on, there were physicians of color, but the big issue, particularly with Black physicians, who was what I was researching, was that they couldn't be educated in the United States. So that was really like the huge barrier. Even if you came from a family who was affluent enough to be able to send you to medical school, then you weren't going to be able to go to any of the medical schools in the United States. But there were definitely people who, all men, who went to Europe and Scotland and were educated there. And I think like the one example, and I'm really sorry, it's been a bunch of years since I did this research, that I based the character of William Blackwood, who is one of the main characters in The Doctor's Discretion on, was educated in Scotland and came back to the United States and tried to practice medicine and just faced such incredible racism that he ended up leaving the US and practicing in Europe instead. So that's kind of where my research went on that topic. What am I reading now? I'm actually between books. So I recently have been reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And I just finished Gideon the Ninth, which I really, really recommend if anyone likes queer fantasy. Definitely not a romance, definitely not a happily ever after ending, but very, very good if you like queer fantasy. And I'm not going to be able to give the author's name because I'm terrible with names.
Tamsin Muir. I've been opening up links as people have been chatting so that I can add these to my own to read list. Where, knowing me, they will sit for a couple of years before I circle back around. But yeah, it's interesting what you're saying about specifically physicians of color in America. In Boston, Harvard Medical School often gets called the first school to allow Black students to attend, and they kicked them out in less than a semester because the students protested. So it's really, they like to use it as a nice milestone, and it's still pretty awful. I have a question about physicians, actually. For you, EE, I wonder, were you inspired by the story of, you used a photo of him in your presentation, and now I'm not going to be able to remember his name, because that's the kind of historian day I'm having. Were you inspired by that story?
Dr. James Berry.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
So yes, I was. So I see people who follow me on Twitter smiling about this because I'm actually very, very interested in James Berry. I've done a ton of research into his life, kind of like in my non-romance writing part of my life. I'm very, very interested in him and his life and the way that he has been written about, interpreted since his death. But yeah, he was definitely inspiration for writing The Doctor's Discretion. I really started thinking about, started thinking about writing a romance novel with two doctors in it because my areas of research are not necessarily medical history, but I really like medical history, so I read a lot of medical history. And I really didn't like how a lot of historical romance talked about doctors and medical professionals. I really felt like that there is a tendency, especially in Regency romance, to play down the real work that medical professionals and medical researchers were doing during that time, and kind of like brush them all aside of like, oh, they're all country quacks, basically. And that really frustrated me because like that's not actually the truth. So I was like, I'm going to write a romance novel and they're both going to be doctors, and, you know, like these are going to be, you know, doctors like we would see today, you know, just in a historical setting, working in a different kind of world with a different set of knowledge about medicine and the human body. So that was kind of like my starting point for it. But then, yeah, when I started specifically doing research into medical professionals, and I found James Berry, you know, who was a trans man and a doctor, that was a huge inspiration for me to write the book.
Excellent.
And I wish I could be like, go and read this cool transpositive work about James Berry, but I can't be because that doesn't exist.
There's a lot of
sad day.
Things that are going to get me fired. There's a lot of it gets turfy, specifically. But Hugh or Ho in the chat mentions Cecil Dream by Theodore Winthrop. Are you familiar with that book?
I'm not.
And so, yeah, they mention it's a mid-1800s book published posthumously in 1861, and it's a queer Gothic novel set in New York City. So I can send that to you.
Yeah.
So add that to my read list too. And Tim mentions that BU School of Medicine is known for first Native American student physician in 1893, Solomon Carter Fuller, male Black psychiatrist, graduated in 1897, and Rebecca Lee Crumpler. I think she was the first African American woman to graduate from a medical school, if I recall correctly. I mentioned earlier, this is like my previous life is diversity and inclusion in medical school history. But anyway, so we have time for one more question if anyone has one final question. We're at 7:59. All right.
Questions have been so good, so like in depth. It's been great.
Yeah, and the answers have been excellent too. Thank you so much, EE, for taking the time to talk to us tonight, and for really getting into it with your research and your methodology. And I feel like I learned a ton. And there's a lot of thank yous popping up in the chat right now too. So yeah, so I'll let us go a minute early, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you again, EE. Folks, keep an eye out for an email with some links to some resources and a copy of the recording. And I will put in the chat one last time as you're all filtering away, a couple links to the History Project's website, to EE's two most recent books, Doctor's Discretion and The Craft of Love. Yep. A Doctor's Discretion is on my to-read list. The Craft of Love is excellent. So I highly suggest picking it up. And with that, I hope everyone has a safe and happy weekend. Yeah. And we'll see you again soon. The History Project's back here next week. We're talking with some more friends from the National Park Service about the queerest house in Cambridge. So keep an eye out for the announcement about RSVPs.
Thank you.